My daughter and her husband emptied my workshop, packed my entire life into garbage bags, and left them at the end of the driveway with a note that said, "You've overstayed your welcome." I read it twice, folded it into my shirt pocket, and made one phone call. 48 hours later, they were calling everyone I'd ever known, leaving frantic messages at every number they had for me. They thought they'd gotten rid of an old man who had nowhere else to go. They forgot who built the ground they were standing on. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are right now. It always means a lot hearing from you. The drive back from my brother's cabin in the Blue Ridge took about 4 hours on a good day. I'd been up there for a long weekend helping him repair the dock before summer hit, something we did most years, a tradition that stretched back to when we were both young men with young knees and strong backs. I was tired but content, the way you get after honest physical work in clean mountain air. My old Silverado smelled like pine sap and lake water, and I had a thermos of bad coffee wedged between the seats. The interstate gave way to county roads, then to the familiar suburban grid of Asheville, and I found myself looking forward to a hot shower and a quiet evening on the back porch. I noticed it before I even turned onto my street. The mailbox was wrong. It took me a moment to understand why. The custom cedar post I'd hand-carved 20 years ago, the one with my last name routed into the wood and painted forest green, had been replaced by a standard black metal stake. It looked like every other mailbox on the block. I slowed down without thinking, staring at it from the driver's seat. Maybe I'd turned onto the wrong street. But no, there was the Hendersons' red door. There was the oak tree I'd watched grow from a sapling since 1987. This was my street. Then I saw the bags. 6 heavy-duty contractor bags lined up along the driveway apron, each one stuffed full and knotted at the top. My first thought, embarrassingly, was that there'd been some kind of emergency cleanup, a burst pipe maybe, or a mold problem. My second thought, arriving just a breath later, was that I recognized the flannel shirt sleeve hanging out of the nearest bag's imperfect knot. That was my flannel shirt. I pulled into the driveway and sat with the engine running for a long moment, hands still on the wheel. Then I got out. The bags held everything from the guest room that had been mine for the past 3 years. Clothes folded and unfolded haphazardly, my reading glasses case cracked from the pressure of whatever was packed above it, the framed photograph of my late wife Carol on our wedding day, with the glass pushed in from one corner, not shattered but bent inward, the way something bends when it's been dropped or thrown. My shaving kit had spilled inside one of the bags. I could smell the cedar soap Carol had bought me every Christmas for 31 years until she couldn't anymore. There was a note tucked under the handle of my toolbox, which had been set apart from the bags, presumably because it was too heavy to lift without real effort. The note was written on the back of an envelope in my daughter Lauren's handwriting. It said, "We love you, but this isn't working anymore. You've overstayed your welcome. We need our space. Your tools are here. Call us when you're settled somewhere." I read it twice, I folded it, and put it in my shirt pocket. Then I tried the front door. The key turned partway and stopped. Brand new deadbolt, the kind with the brushed nickel finish that Lauren had been talking about for months. I remembered her mentioning wanting to upgrade all the locks in the house. I just hadn't imagined what the upgrade would mean for me. I walked around to the back. Slider was locked, too. The garage keypad, the one I'd known the code to for 3 years, the one I'd used every single morning to go get my coffee from the workshop fridge because I woke up earlier than anyone else in the house, that keypad now flashed red when I punched in my numbers. Changed. I stood in the backyard for a while. It was a Thursday afternoon in late April, and the dogwood I'd planted for Carol's memory 3 years ago, the one I'd carried home in a root ball from the nursery, and dug into that exact corner of the yard myself, was blooming white. It was the only tree in the yard that bloomed that color. I'd planted it 2 weeks after moving in, after Lauren said the yard needed something her mother would have liked. I called Lauren's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called my son-in-law Derek's number. 2 rings, then silence, then voicemail. I stood there in my own backyard, locked out of the house I had paid for, listening to my own breathing. The neighbors to the east, a retired couple named Frank and Bev, who I'd shared a fence and many a slow evening conversation with over the years, had their curtains shifted slightly when I glanced over. I walked to their door and knocked. Frank answered, which I'd expected. Frank was a straight talker. Bev was the one who felt things too deeply to look you in the face when something hard was happening. "Frank," I said, Did you happen to see what went on here today? He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who's been hoping he wouldn't have to have a particular conversation. Then he stepped outside and pulled the door mostly shut behind him. Their moving truck was here around noon, he said. Couple of guys. Took some things out of the house, put other things in the bags. I figured you knew. Did Lauren say anything to you? He shook his head slowly. She waved at Bev when she left, that's all. I thanked him. He looked like he wanted to say more but didn't, and I respected him for knowing the difference between comfort and noise. I walked back to my truck. Here's the thing about being 63 years old, with a dead wife, a loaded-out truck, and a daughter who has just changed the locks on the house you've been supporting for 3 years. There is a version of that story where you sit down on the curb and feel the full weight of what's happening, let it break over you like cold water. And there's another version. I chose the second version. I started loading the bags into the truck bed carefully, not angrily, the way you load anything fragile that matters to you. The photograph of Carol went on the seat beside me, face up. The toolbox I'd owned since I was 22. A Craftsman set I'd bought with my first real paycheck from the construction firm that went behind the seat, which was where it lived in the truck anyway, which was where it had always lived. I collected the note from my shirt pocket, unfolded it, read it a third time, then folded it again and put it in the glove compartment. Evidence has its uses. What Lauren and Derek had forgotten, what they had perhaps never known in any real way, was why I had moved in with them in the first place. It was 3 years ago, 2 months after Carol passed. Lauren called me, genuinely worried, genuinely loving in the way she was capable of being loving. She said the house felt too big for just Derek and her and the kids, that the guest suite on the main floor was empty, that she wanted her father close. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that they'd been struggling a little with the mortgage since Derek's company had cut bonuses, and that having someone contribute to the household expenses would help them breathe easier. I want to be clear about what I understood that conversation to mean. I understood that my daughter needed her father, and I understood that her father's financial contribution was part of why she needed him. I'm 63, not naive. But I was also 2 months out from losing the woman I'd loved for 34 years, and the idea of being needed, of having somewhere to be and something to give, was the only rope I could find to hold on to. So I sold the house Carol and I had owned outright, a 4-bedroom colonial in Roanoke, worth about $340,000 at the time I sold it, and I moved into Lauren's guest suite with my clothes, my tools, and my wife's wedding photograph. What I contributed over the following 3 years I kept meticulous records of, because that's who I am. Monthly payments toward the mortgage, $2,000. Groceries, which I handled most weeks, averaging about $800 a month. Utility bills, which I paid directly, around $400. Repairs and improvements to the house and property, including the deck I rebuilt from scratch last summer using lumber I bought and skills I provided, approximately $14,000 over the 3 years combined. I also paid for both grandchildren's after-school programs for 18 months, when Derek's company went through its second round of layoffs. In return, I had a room, I had my family nearby, and for the first year, I had the feeling that I was home. Then things changed. It was gradual enough that I'd been making excuses for the timeline. Derek started spending more time upstairs when I was in the common areas. Lauren began what I came to think of as efficiency conversations, quick and functional, designed to convey information without actually connecting. My opinions at dinner became less frequently solicited. The grandchildren, who I adored, and who I had believed adored me, were increasingly occupied with activities scheduled during the hours I was usually available. The guest suite felt less like a room in a family home and more like a unit in a building where I happened to know the owners. By January of this year, I was eating breakfast alone most mornings. By March, Lauren had mentioned twice, both times lightly, both times with a smile that didn't involve her eyes, that she and Derek were thinking about converting the guest suite into a home office. I told myself she was processing something, working through whatever midlife pressures were bearing down on her. I gave her the benefit of the doubt because that's what parents do with their children, long past the point when children have stopped doing it for them. The contractor bags lined up on the driveway were the end of the benefit of the doubt. I drove to a Hampton Inn off the interstate and paid for 2 nights in cash. The room was clean and anonymous, with a laminated breakfast menu on the desk and a view of the parking lot. I brought Carol's photograph and my important documents folder inside, locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and did something I hadn't done since the day of Carol's funeral. I cried. Not for long, but enough to acknowledge what had actually happened and what it meant. Then I opened my document folder and started reading. I had always kept the originals of everything. Every financial record that bore my name, every agreement I'd ever signed, every bank statement going back 15 years. Carol had teased me about it for decades, calling me her human filing cabinet. I had the mortgage documents from Lauren and Derek's loan. I had the refinancing agreement from 2 years ago, the one they'd needed a co-signer for when the bank questioned their debt-to-income ratio. I had 3 years of canceled checks. But more than any of that, I had the promissory agreement. 18 months into my time with them, Lauren and Derek had asked me for something more direct. They were behind on property taxes, 2 years' worth, and the county had sent a final notice. The amount was $17,000. They didn't have it. I did. I'd given it to them as a loan, not a gift, because Derek had insisted, because his pride required the word loan, even if we all privately understood the difference. We had drawn up a simple promissory note, witnessed by Frank next door, for the full $17,000, repayable over 5 years at modest interest. They had made 4 payments. Lauren and Derek had thrown me out of a house I had poured roughly $200,000 into over 3 years, including the tax loan, including the repairs, including the monthly contributions. They had done this believing, I think, that I was a tired old man with nowhere concrete to go and no particular options available to me. They were about to discover the distance between what they believed and what was true. I called my attorney in the morning. His name is Paul Whitfield, and I've known him since we both coached Little League in the same suburban park 25 years ago. He's semi-retired now, but he picks up for me. I explained the situation in a few sentences. "Come in at 9, he said. Bring everything." His office had the comfortable clutter of a man who had been practicing long enough to stop caring about impressions. He reviewed my documents across a broad oak desk, reading slowly and carefully, occasionally making a small sound that communicated nothing but attention. When he finished, he set the stack down and folded his hands. "The promissory note is enforceable," he said. $17,000 plus the accrued interest they haven't paid. You can file in civil court today if you want, but that's the small piece. Tell me again about the refinancing. I told him. 2 years ago, when interest rates shifted and Lauren and Derek wanted to refinance to lower their monthly payment, the bank had required a co-signer because Derek's credit had taken damage from the layoff period. I had co-signed. I had signed as a co-borrower on a property I did not legally own any portion of, because Lauren had asked me to, because it would help the family, because I had still been operating under the assumption that family meant something reciprocal. Paul looked at me over his reading glasses. "As a co-borrower, you have certain rights with respect to the property," he said carefully. "Not ownership rights. The title is in their names. But a co-borrower's financial exposure creates standing. You can compel a conversation they will not enjoy having." I asked him what that meant practically. "It means," he said, "that if you notify the lender of your intent to withdraw your support as co-borrower and request to be removed from the loan, the bank will require Lauren and Derek to refinance without you. Given their current financial profile, that will be extremely difficult, possibly impossible. The bank will want to have a conversation with everyone on the loan. That conversation will include your documentation of contributions and the outstanding promissory note." He paused and looked at me. "They changed the locks on the house you've been financially supporting," he said, "and sent you away with your belongings in garbage bags. They did this without legal counsel, without any formal agreement, and without apparent awareness of the paper trail you've maintained. That is a significant oversight on their part." I thanked him, and we spent the next 2 hours being precise and thorough. I left with a clear picture of what my options were, which ones I intended to use, and in what order. The first call I made from the parking lot was to the mortgage servicer. I explained that I was a co-borrower on a loan, gave them the account number for my documents, and informed them that I was experiencing a dispute with the primary borrowers and wished to discuss my options regarding my co-borrower status. The representative transferred me to a specialist, who asked careful questions and told me I would be receiving documentation within 5 to 7 business days, and that the primary borrowers would be notified of my inquiry, as per standard procedure. They would receive that notification within the week. The second call was to a financial advisor I'd been working with for the past decade. I asked him to review the liquidation of a portion of my investment portfolio, something I'd been considering anyway, and to identify the most efficient structure for the proceeds. This was not spite, this was planning. When you are 63 and your child has just reminded you that security can be revoked without notice, you organize. I did not call Lauren or Derek. I did not respond to the text Lauren sent that Friday morning, which read, "Dad, I hope you found somewhere comfortable. We can talk when you're ready." I did not respond because I was not ready, and because I was no longer certain that ready meant what Lauren thought it meant. I drove to Asheville's farmer's market and spent 2 hours walking around. I bought peaches, which were early and slightly tart and perfect, and coffee from a woman who roasted her own beans, and I sat on a bench in the April sunlight and thought about Carol. She would have hated this, not because she couldn't handle conflict, but because she had loved Lauren in the way that mothers love daughters, completely, and with a kind of deliberate blindness toward certain things. She would have grieved it. I was grieving it too, in my way, in the way that involves sitting in the sun eating slightly tart peaches and deciding what comes next. What came next was this. I extended my hotel stay to 1 week. I rented a small furnished apartment on a month-to-month basis on the east side of town, the kind of place designed for people in transition, people who have somewhere to go but haven't gotten there yet. I was comfortable. I was, in some way I hadn't expected, freer than I had been in 2 years. I turned my phone to silent on day 3. Not off, not unreachable, just silent. I checked it twice a day, morning and evening, the way you check the weather. On day 4, there were 11 missed calls. On day 5, 23. By the end of day 6, when the mortgage servicer notification had presumably arrived at their house, there were 41. The voicemails told a story in 3 acts. The first act was controlled, almost performative. Lauren's voice, measured and careful. "Dad, the bank called us about some kind of inquiry. Can you call me back so we can clear this up?" Derek, professional. "Hey, this is probably a misunderstanding. Call us." Second act, less controlled. Lauren, "Dad, we're trying to understand what's happening. The bank is saying there might be an issue with the loan. This is serious, and we need to talk." Derek, the measured tone beginning to fray. "I don't know what Paul Whitfield told you, but we should talk before anyone does anything they can't undo." Third act, honest. Lauren, her voice stripped of its management. "Dad, please. I don't know where you're staying, and it's been a week. We made a mistake. I made a mistake. The way we handled things was wrong, and I know that. Please just call me." I listened to all of them on day 7, sitting on the small balcony of my temporary apartment with a cup of real coffee. The dogwood across the street from the complex was blooming, a different tree, a different yard, but the same white flowers. I thought about the tree I'd planted for Carol in Lauren's backyard. I thought about the fact that I had planted it, and what that meant about who that yard had really belonged to. I called Paul. I told him to proceed with the formal co-borrower dispute notification. I called the financial advisor and confirmed the portfolio review. I looked up furnished rentals in Brevard, which was 40 minutes west of Asheville and far enough away to feel like a different chapter. I had grown up in western North Carolina, and after 30 years in Virginia with Carol, the mountains had been calling me back in a way I'd been too anchored to answer. Lauren and Derek drove to my apartment on day 8. I don't know how they found it. Frank, probably, or someone who had seen my truck. They knocked on my door at 7 in the evening, and I opened it because I had decided I was ready. Lauren looked like someone who had not been sleeping. Derek stood slightly behind her, which I noted, and which I thought said something true about the nature of the decisions that had been made. "Dad," Lauren said, "please let us come in." I stepped back from the doorway. They sat on the small sofa. I sat across from them in the armchair with a cup of coffee I did not offer to share, not from cruelty, but because I was conserving my own comfort and I'd decided that was allowed. Lauren talked for a long time. She talked about the pressures of the past year, Derek's work situation, her own anxiety, the way the house had started to feel crowded in ways she hadn't known how to talk about. She talked about making a decision quickly, emotionally, without thinking through what it actually meant or what it would cost. She said she was sorry 3 times in the first 5 minutes. The kind of sorry that was also an explanation, working toward something. I let her finish. Then I said, "You left my wife's photograph in a garbage bag at the end of the driveway." Lauren's face changed. I said, "You changed the locks without a conversation, without notice, without any discussion of what I was owed or what our arrangement had been. You left me a note on the back of an envelope. You let 3 days go by without calling to ask if I was safe or where I was sleeping. That's what happened. That's the thing we're actually talking about." She started to cry. I had not been trying to make her cry, but I wasn't going to manage her experience of the truth. That wasn't my job anymore. Derek spoke for the first time. He said, "We want you to come back. We want to figure out a real arrangement, something fair." I told them what Paul had told me, in plain language. I explained what a co-borrower dispute meant for their loan. I explained that the promissory note represented a debt I intended to collect. Not immediately, not brutally, but through legitimate channels, according to the agreement they had signed. I explained that I had been reviewing whether to remain in Asheville at all, and that Brevard was looking appealing. Lauren said, "You can't just leave." I said, "You told me I'd overstayed my welcome. You made that decision for me. I'm making some decisions for myself now." Derek said, "What do we have to do?" That was the question I had been waiting for, the honest one, stripped of performance. I told them that I was not coming back to the guest suite. That chapter was finished. I told them that I expected the promissory note to be paid in full within 18 months, per a revised schedule Paul would send them. I told them that I would remain on the mortgage loan as co-borrower until they could refinance without me, and that during that time I expected to be treated as a stakeholder, not a charity case, which meant being informed of any major financial decisions affecting the property. I told them that I was moving to Brevard and that I expected to see my grandchildren on a regular schedule that we would work out in good faith, and that if that good faith was not extended, I had other options I preferred not to exercise. Lauren asked if I would ever forgive her. I said that forgiveness and trust were two different things, and that I was working on one of them. They left an hour later, looking smaller than when they'd arrived. I washed my coffee cup, stood at the window of my temporary apartment for a while, and felt the particular quiet of a situation that has moved past its crisis point into something slower and more manageable. 3 weeks later, I drove to Brevard with my truck loaded and my toolbox behind the seat. I'd found a house, not a rental, a small craftsman bungalow with a workshop space in the backyard and a creak you could hear from the kitchen window on quiet mornings. I had bought it outright, cash, a portion of the proceeds from Carol's house that I had kept in reserve for what she always called the right moment. She had a saying, something her own father had told her, that you should save a portion of everything, not for emergencies, but for opportunities. The right moment for this money had turned out to be a creekside workshop in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The first morning there, I made coffee in my own kitchen, in my own house, with my own grounds, and carried it out to the workshop where my tools were still in their cases, waiting to be hung. Carol's photograph was on the windowsill, where it would catch the morning light. The dogwood in the front yard, which the previous owners had planted years ago and tended carefully, was just beginning to open. I thought about Lauren, who was navigating the consequences of a decision made in a moment of small-heartedness. I thought about Derek, who had let it happen. I thought about my grandchildren, who I would see in 3 weeks, when Lauren drove them up for a weekend, an arrangement she had agreed to without negotiation, which I understood to be its own form of apology. I thought about Carol, who had loved this part of the state, who had talked about retiring here, who had never gotten the chance to be old enough to choose her own geography. I was choosing it for both of us. There's a specific kind of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge that you handled it on your own terms. I had not been cruel. I had not retaliated out of pain or punished anyone in excess of what the situation warranted. I had simply stopped making myself small to fit inside a space designed to use me up and discard me. I had remembered, at 63, that I was not a tenant in my own life. I hung the first tool on its hook, a level that had been with me since I built my first deck at 38, and I stood back and looked at the row of empty hooks waiting for the rest, and I thought, this is going to be a good place to grow old. I was right. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Pure Revenge Stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And when you're ready for the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for being here.